I, I do teach at Southeastern on a theology of creation, and I enjoy teaching it very much, and I do enjoy going through the history of the development of the doctrine of creation and how it impacted Western thought and science. Here's the thing to remember as we look at the early church. In the days of the early church, the debate was not between creation and evolution. The debate was not over whether or not the earth was young or whether or not the earth was old. The debate was over whether or not the earth was created and if it was eternal. And so it was the debate between creationism and eternalism. In fact, the pagan philosophers, from Aristotle especially, they argued ex nihilo nihilo fit. That is, out of nothing comes nothing. And so they argued that the world either came from God, or, which would be a pantheism, or that there is some type of reality other than God that God used, which is dualism. Christians argued for theism. No, God created creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. And so from about the 2nd through the 6th century, there is a running skirmish going on between the pagan philosophers and the Christian thinkers about whether or not the universe is eternal or whether or not it has a time in which it began. And so that was the debate in the early church. It almost becomes sidelined in the 6th century. In the 6th century, there is a debate over whether or not the earth is flat or round. It's a dispute that breaks out among the Christians. And this dispute, as I said, really almost derails the real controversy, and that is whether or not the earth is created or if it's been here forever. And so as we take a look at the debate that went on in the 6th century, I think there's some lessons that are applicable to today. And so what does it tell us? Well, let's remember how the main question, creation versus eternal, can sometimes be lost to debates that miss the point, flat earth versus round earth. Let's not be distracted from what really matters. And it's a reminder, I think, that we need to remember about the difference between the doctrine of creation and the apologetic of creationism. One is a doctrine, and the other is an approach to science, and we need to remember the difference. Also, there is the ironic historical lesson. As you know, in the 16th century, in the 17th century, there will be the Copernican revolution, and Galileo will get into a great deal of trouble with the Roman Catholic Church. The interesting thing about that is that the Roman Catholic Church was so committed to the Ptolemaic system, they seem to have forgot that back from the 2nd to the 6th century, the debate was whether or not to accept the Ptolemaic system, because the Ptolemaic system seemed and smelled too pagan. And so they eventually baptized the Ptolemaic system and incorporated into their models so thoroughly that whenever the Copernican revolution happens, they perceive that to be a threat, which was a terrible error. So, and I think it is a precursor for some of the disagreements that we have among various creationists today. And I think, especially with what happens, it will serve as a template for how I think progress can be made in this conversation. One of the things I like that Reasons to Believe does is that it presents a testable model. And what this does is that it is an attempt to move science forward. What's going to happen is that John Philoponus, who is a philosopher of the 6th century, a Christian philosopher, is going to refute the Aristotelian notion of eternalism, and he's going to do so in such a way that he's going to begin to dismantle Aristotelianism, and as a result will actually cause a revolution in science. And so I think this is one of the crucial things to understand. What will make the scientific world sit up and take notice to what we're doing is whenever we make predictions and present models that actually move the ball forward scientifically. So without further ado, let's remind ourselves as we look at all of the problems that happened in the 6th century. George had it right. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And so let's take a look at what happened back in the 6th century and see if there's some lessons we can learn. As I said, back in the days of the early church, the Neoplatonic philosophers and the pagan philosophers attacked the doctrine of creation, and they did so by arguing that the universe is eternal. And what they would do is that they would incorporate the Aristotelian system of physics. You had Aristotelian eternalism. Like I said, Neoplatonic thought was a merger or a merging of Platonism and Aristotelian metaphysics and physics, and in so doing, Neoplatonism becomes the predominant philosophy of the first 6 centuries of the Western era. So you have those like Plotinus and others that argued that God eternally created, and he did so out of necessity, and there is no such thing as contingency in the universe. And also, by the 2nd century, you have the Ptolemaic cosmology, and of course that has the Earth at the center, and it has the various spheres going around, of which the planets and the sun have their various spheres all the way to the outermost sphere in which the stars are embedded. So, there are a series of debates that happen at this time between the Neoplatonic philosophers and the Christian philosophers. We have a book by Proclus, one of the great philosophers of the 5th century, who writes a book called On the Eternity of the World. And in it, it is an attack against Christianity, and it is particularly an attack against the Christian doctrine of creation. And he gives 18 arguments against the Christian doctrine of creation in favor of an eternal universe. Now, his arguments, in many ways, whenever we read them, they seem rather quaint to us because we don't hold to an Aristotelian system and a metaphysic. But the arguments that he made is that he argued that all motion is the result of the 4 elements being in constant turmoil. You remember what they are? You know, earth, wind, fire, and yes, they were a great group in the 70s, and water. So you have those 4 elements, and what they would argue is each of these elements, Aristotle describes them almost in psychological terms, that they are each seeking their own proper place. And that is why the rock drops through the water, because the rock doesn't want to be in the water. It wants to be down below. And why the air will bubble up through the water and why the fire will go even higher is because each one is trying to find its proper level according to its nature. And so that would be the 4 elements that he argued. And he said, now, the 5th element, if you notice, they don't go up and down. He said that the 5th elements go in a circle. They're eternal, everlasting. And so he said that the outer space, or what we would call outer space today, with the heavens, are made up of a 5th element, the quintessence. That's where we get our expression for quintessential. And this would be, sometimes they would call that the ether or something of that nature. And they would argue that it is eternal and everlasting. And so celestial motion is different from the motion of the mundane elements here. Now notice what they have in this way of thinking. The laws of nature dictating what happens here on earth is different from the laws dictating that in the heavens. So you have a bifurcation of the natural order in the Aristotelian way of thinking. So that would be the idea of a quintessence. Then they said, since the heavens are made of the 5th element, then the sun doesn't consist of heat. It doesn't have fire. You say, well, wait a minute. Why is the sun so hot? Well, Aristotle said, well, maybe it's because of friction. And they argued that the stars and the sun could not be made up of fire, or else they would have already burned up. And they said that the circular nature of the orbits of the spheres demonstrate their eternal nature. A circle has no beginning, a circle has no end, so therefore they must have always have been in circular motion. This circular and unending motion of the heavens is seen as evidence of its eternal nature. So, and they said the heavens then therefore were not generated or created because they do not have a contrary. You've got to remember, in Aristotelian way of thinking, everything comes in pairs. Everything has an opposite. There's light, there's darkness, there's heat, there's cold, there's dry, there's wet. Everything has its contrary. And they said, well, the heavens have no contrary, so therefore they must be eternal. Like I said, some of these arguments seem rather quaint to us, but they seemed rather persuasive back then. Well, John Philoponus is a Christian philosopher who lived in Alexandria at about that same time. And so he writes a book in response, and he answers the pagans on their own terms. By that, what I mean is he doesn't appeal to Scripture at this point. He'll do that later. But at this point, he simply argues a philosophical argument. And when he does, he doesn't just answer the notion. Not only does he defend the notion of creation, but he actually overthrows or begins the overthrow of the Aristotelian way of thinking about science. So he sets a revolution in motion. Historians of science will argue that Philoponus was the man ahead of his time and that he sowed the seeds of the scientific revolution. What he does is he begins the process of dismantling Aristotelian physics, and he establishes unified system of dynamics. In other words, he says that the laws that order this world also order the heavens. Thomas Kuhn will actually credit Philoponus' theory of impetus as a paradigmatic scientific revolution. And so, Galileo will actually depend upon Philoponus more than anyone else. He will cite him more than he does Plato, Albert, or Scotus. And so here is a very significant Christian philosopher who I think is going to make who makes a very big impact. Well, one of his classmates, Simplicius, will try to write a book in opposition, but it doesn't really do a whole lot. He will be the last of the great pagan philosophers, and so he will write a book aptly named, Against Philoponus, on the eternity of the world. And so you have this give and take debate going on. And Philoponus is holding his own and is making life difficult for the Aristotelian pagan philosophers. Wait a minute. Now let me go ahead and talk about Philoponus' response to Aristotle and eternalism. And you can see the arguments that he makes. And then we have somebody who's going to kind of blindside him, as we're going to see. So, Philoponus disposes of some of Aristotle's arguments rather easily, as you might imagine. He will say, well, the idea that the circular nature of the orbits demonstrate that they are eternal, since a circle has no beginning or end. He says, well, you know, in a Euclidean plane, a straight line has no beginning or end. So that's really not that impressive a point. And the idea that they have no they were not generated because they have no contrary. He said, well, everything has a contrary. Privation is a contrary to existence. And so he says, so that really doesn't carry much water. And then he said, the notion that the heavens are made of a fifth element and that the sun did not consist of fire nor contain heat. He said, just because the celestial bodies haven't burned up yet doesn't mean they never will. And then he said, the reason why we don't feel the heat of the stars is probably because they're so far away. And if the heavens had no beginning, or if they do have a beginning, which they do, he says, then they can also have an end. And so they're not eternal. And if the heavens are perishable, then there's no reason to believe that they're made up of something else, something different. There's no reason to believe that the heavens are made up of a fifth element. And if the heavens are made up of the same elements as the earth, then therefore the same principles of motion apply to both. And so Philoponus is saying things that, of course, to us seem rather obvious, but it was radical, new, and revolutionary then. And so then he points out that really the whole notion of eternalism contradicts Aristotle himself. Because Aristotle argued vehemently that an actual eternal cannot exist in nature. And he said, but if you point out, he says, using your own logic, he said, the notion of an eternal universe contradicts that very thinking because that would be an actual infinite. If an eternal cosmos requires infinite time. Not only does it require infinite time, it requires infinite motion. Both things that Aristotle said were impossible. And so, Philoponus answers Aristotle on his own terms. And as he does so, he dismantles Aristotle's theory of motion altogether. And here's where he starts having a lot of fun. You think about it, the way Aristotle explained it, he explained why everything went up or down, because they are looking for their proper order, their proper place. You have earth, then you have water, and then you have air, and then you have fire. Yes, but what about horizontal motion? What about lateral movement? Well, Aristotle has a great deal of trouble explaining why things move sideways. In fact, Aristotle's explanation of why when a man throws a javelin, why does the javelin go forward? And he's trying to explain somehow how the air goes behind it and pushes it. Why Philoponus just has a heyday with that. He said, well, if that were true, then if you see the army marching towards you, just have a bunch of arrows out there and blow behind them, and they'll all go forward. He said, no, that can't be what works. If movement is caused by the elements seeking their proper vertical level, why does the javelin move forward when it's thrown? And there's where he has an eureka moment. And Philoponus says, I think what's going on is that when the thrower throws the javelin, he imparts a force into the javelin, and he calls it impetus. He suggests that this impetus is the reason why it goes forward. And of course, what will happen is Galileo and others will take this innovation and they will develop it into the concept of inertia. And it will be Philoponus who brings forth this idea. Well, like I said, this is the beginning of a new scientific paradigm. Philoponus presents a powerful case against the Neoplatonic doctrine of an eternal world, and in so doing, he not only refutes the idea of eternalism, he overthrows much of the Aristotelian physics underlying it. And like I said, historians of science will see Philoponus as providing two crucial steps towards the formation of science as a discipline: the concept of impetus and the notion that the entire universe is under one set of laws. So it's remarkable. Pretty impressive, don't you think? Not everybody thought so. You see, there was a fellow by the name of Cosmas. And Cosmas Indigo Plestes, which means Indian traveler, was a Nestorian monk who was a navigator and a sailor before he became a monk. He is very unhappy with the works of Philoponus. And so the reason why he's unhappy with him is because Philoponus has accepted the notion that the world is round. Well, like I said, he was a worldwide traveler. And in fact, he was quite a geographer. Even today, historians will use some of the drawings and writings of Cosmas because he was one of the most well-traveled men of the ancient world. And so what he does, to refute Philoponus, he writes a book called Christian Topography. And he offers a flat earth alternative that he considers to be more in keeping with the biblical record and the physical evidence. And so he's going to argue for a flat earth. So Cosmas doesn't just argue for a flat earth. He attacks Philoponus's character and motives. Boy, I'm glad that doesn't happen today, aren't you? So he calls Philoponus a compromiser. He says to him, "Is it not evident that you argue against the hope held out by the Christian doctrine? For your views cannot be consistently held except by the pagans, who have no hope of another and better state, and who consistently suppose the world is eternal." And so he considers him to be a compromiser. He considers him to be intellectually arrogant. You know, Philoponus was trained in the academy. And so that was not considered to be a selling point for Cosmas. He says, "How great is your knowledge, how great is your wisdom, how great your intelligence, how great your inconsistency." So you can tell that Cosmas doesn't like him. And he argues there's no middle ground here. Cosmas says, look, either the world is flat or Christianity is false. And so he's going to set things in such a binary way that there is no middle ground. It is against such two-faced men my words are directed, who wish to occupy a middle position. There is no middle position. These ones who want to argue a middle position, they laugh at everyone and themselves are laughed at by all. So, what was Cosmas's description of the flat earth model? He argued that the heavens form a vault. And one of the things that we have with Cosmas is that he was quite the illustrator. And so we have a number of his drawings. And so he argued that the heavens are in the form of a chest. And the heavens form a vault over the earth. And the universe is in the shape of a chest. The earth is flat because it is the floor of the chest. And he argues that the inhabited world is one great big gigantic continent, and it's indented by various seas, and it's surrounded by an ocean that is unnavigable, and it acts as an impassable moat. And again, this is one of his drawings. So he argues that the heavens are attached to the earth by the giant walls at the perimeter, and these walls give the cosmos its rectangular shape. Now, the firmament at the top of the wall separates the heavens into two parts, and that's why the Bible speaks of the heavens as in plural. There's two heavens, which I don't know what he did with Paul's mention of the third heaven in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And so he argues threefold for a flat earth. He used proof texts from Scripture, he uses the tabernacle in the wilderness, and then he argues from his current understanding of geography. Excuse me. And so what were his biblical arguments? Well, he pointed to the several passages that you have, like in Isaiah and other places, where the heavens are presented as a metaphor of a vault or a canopy or a tent. And so he argues that those are to be understood literally. He criticizes Philoponus for not interpreting the Bible literally. And then he argues that the earth is said to have extremities which cannot be said of a sphere. He said, look, you can either believe Jesus or you can believe in a round earth. Because Jesus said that the angels will gather people from the four corners of the earth. And he said that the Queen of Sheba came from the end of the earth. There is no end of the earth on a round globe, and there is no four corners on a round globe, so who are you going to believe? And so he set it up in such a way where we either believe the Bible and Jesus, or we believe these worldly philosophers and these compromisers who want to engage with them. And so he argues, he said, okay, what happens then? Well, the sun goes over the sky every day. Then what happens at night? He says, well, there's a giant mountain in the north. And that the earth goes, and the sun goes behind that mountain every night and then returns back. And he does so, he argues, based on his interpretation of Ecclesiastes 1, 5, and 6. And if I had time, we might go through that, but we don't. Well, he says there could be no one living on the other underside of the earth because the Bible speaks only of those on the earth, in the earth, but never under the earth. And so here's where he drew a drawing making fun of the idea of people being on the underside of the earth. And he says there if you believe the earth is round, then there could be no resurrection. Because the Bible says that the dead will rise. Well, they're going to be on the wrong side of the earth. They're going to go the wrong direction. And he said there's a spherical cosmology has no place for a coming kingdom of heaven. And so he even rejects the possibility that the heavens revolve. And he argues that a round earth renders Noah's flood impossible, because anyone knows if you have a volleyball and you pour water on it, the water pours right off. And so that you could not have had a universal flood. So those would be his biblical arguments. Then he moved to the tabernacle in the wilderness, and he has quite a fascinating interpretation. He takes the book of Hebrews and he argues that the book of Hebrews is teaching us that the heavens are the true tabernacle, and the earthly tabernacle is a replica of the cosmos. And so he then gives a unique, detailed interpretation of the tabernacle, in which he argues, as you look at the tabernacle, that's exactly how the earth and the heavens are shaped. The third thing that gets interesting, the third argument that he makes, is the arguments based on the depictions of geography in his day. He argues that the biblical description of the distribution of Noah's offspring indicates the rectangular shape to the inhabited world. And the map of Epirus, one of the ancient cartographers, has the Indians in the east, the Celts in the west, the Ethiopians in the south, the Scythians in the north. See, that's a square, flat earth. And this is his finished drawing whenever he said this is how it looks in toto. So, but Cosmos, when you read his book, he spends a great deal of time basing his argument from first-hand knowledge acquired from his own personal travels. And so, as he does so, there's a number of objections raised. And so he answers them in each edition of the book in a number of appendices. Well, one of the objections that is raised is about the size of the sun. Some would ask him, how could the sun possibly be hidden behind a mountain in the north, as you hold, since it is very high and the sun is many times bigger than the earth? Well, this is the way Cosmos answered that. He rejected the premise that of the objection because he said that the sun is actually much smaller than the earth. He did his calculations. What he did was during his travels as far south as Ethiopia and as far north as Asia Minor, he noticed that on the same day of the year, the sun cast shadows at different angles depending on the latitude, as you could see here. And so he argued that based on that, he said, according to his calculations, he said the earth is about 12,000 miles long, 6,000 miles wide. The sun is about 4,000 miles above us, and it's about 44 to 42 miles wide. And that's how he did his calculations based on the angles depending on the latitude. Now, he never considered that positing a spherical earth explains the same phenomena, only better, which various philosophers as early as the 3rd century BC had already determined. Well, what happens is, there in Alexandria, they have a debate. They have the flat earthers and the round earthers come to meet. And he says, well, if the sun really is smaller than the earth, then there should be a shadow cast, but it shouldn't be conical. And he said, well, we had a debate, we met, we had our experiments, and they held up a globe, and they did it from long distance, short distance, trying to see if the shadow actually narrowed down. And he says, he doesn't say how far along the distance was, but it was obviously not far enough, because if they had, they would have noticed that, yes, it does make a cone shape. So those in attendance considered the evidence of the experiment to be in Cosmos's favor. And so he writes to his mentor how we emerged from this debate victorious. Well, Cosmos's parting shot at Philoponus was this. He said, if anyone doubts that adhering to a round earth does not lead one to abandoning the doctrine of creation, look no further than the philosophers themselves. He said, not a one of them holds to an eternal earth. And he said the only early church father that Philoponus can appeal to who holds to a round earth is Origen, or Origin, depends on how you say the G. And he said, he's a heretic. So, look at the company you keep. So, what was Philoponus' response to Cosmas? Well, he writes a commentary on Genesis called On the Creation of the World. He had two aims in mind. First, he wanted to demonstrate that the doctrine of creation, as presented by Moses, is compatible with the phenomena, that is, around earth, as understood by the natural philosophers. And second, he considered Cosmas' arguings to be the brain of an ignorant ass. And he was concerned, he was worried that Cosmas' views would be taken seriously and that his pagan, the ones he was interacting with, he was afraid they would take him, this is the standard Christian position. And he was very concerned about that. So he responds to Cosmas' handling of the biblical text as to the notion that the Bible teaches that the world is tent-shaped. He said, do you not know metaphors when you see one? And second, that the notion that the Bible teaches the sun returns via the north. He said, that is not at all what Ecclesiastes 1, 5, and 6 is teaching. He said, and so he makes the point, not only are you a bad scientist, you're a bad exegete. And then he explains the purpose of the creation account in Genesis. He says Moses is teaching us about God, not giving us something that is a technical scientific explanation. He's writing to a general audience. And so he says to them very clearly, we are to read it as it was intended to the original audience. And let me give just a few concluding thoughts about this debate, and that was the end of it. The debate between Cosmas and Philoponus reminds us of the importance of distinguishing, as I said, between creation and creationism. The doctrine of creation has those unchanging truths. A good God created this world out of nothing. That is what we hold to as unchanging. As science changes, creationism has to change because we are engaged with the science as we know it to be at this time. Now, Philoponus and Cosmas didn't get along. Philoponus considered Cosmas ignorant. Cosmas saw Philoponus as a traitor. But the disagreement between the two was over which approach was more faithful to their mutual Christian belief. And I think I have to point this out, and this is an important point. Philoponus wins, and Cosmas loses. Now you see what do I mean? Not just in the sense that he's right, but that Philoponus' position becomes the prevailing view. The early church did not believe the earth is flat. Whether it's Roger Bacon, the Venerable Bede, Thomas Aquinas, the theologians of the medieval era believe that the earth is round. And you have some who try to argue that the Roman church was against Columbus traveling west because they argued that the earth was flat. That's not what they argued. They didn't think that the earth was flat. The Roman church and their concerns about Columbus going west was not that they thought that, okay, you're going to fall off the edge of the earth. No, they thought he had his numbers wrong. Columbus argued that the earth was only 8,000 miles around and that he would be able to make it. That is, he should be able to only travel 1,000 to 2,000 miles west and arrive at India. The Roman scholars said, your numbers are wrong. It's more like 24,000 to 25,000 miles around, and you're not going to make it. Now, it turns out that the Roman church is right, and lucky for Columbus, he ran into this little thing called the Americas, because that's something that neither side knew existed. And so it wasn't that the medieval church believed the earth was flat. They didn't. They embraced Philoponus' arguments, and they believed that the earth was indeed, or is indeed round. So Cosmas' position was never taken seriously by the church as a whole. In fact, I think we have a word of caution here. Philoponus may have won too well. He was right about the earth being round, and so they not only embraced that the earth is round, but they embraced the whole Ptolemaic model, that the earth is round and therefore it's in the center of the universe, and all of the other planets and stars are rotating around the earth. Now, Cosmos shows that sometimes it's possible to be right in principle, but wrong at the question at hand. Yes, there are concerns about the natural philosophers and their arguments that a round earth makes for an eternal earth. That's not the question at hand. He was right in his overall rejection of the Aristotelian Ptolemaic worldview. But he was obviously wrong about the particular issue whether the world was round. He made that a hill on which to die, and die he did. Philoponus takes a different tack. He engages with the natural philosophers. He studies to learn what the natural philosophers believe about the world at that time. And so he is someone who's able to answer them on their own terms. So did any of Cosmos' criticisms of Philoponus have merit? Well, yes. Philoponus does accept many of the errant theories of his day. However, Cosmos is committed to a universe created in time, no matter where he thinks that takes him logically. And here's the error of Cosmos' thinking. He's saying, okay, the pagans believe in a round world, and the pagans believe a round world is an eternal world. Therefore, the world must be flat. And there's the logical fallacy of Cosmos' thinking. Let's remember just how wrong the pagans were in Cosmos' day, and I believe non-believers in many ways, especially in methodological naturalism, are wrong in their thinking today. So history demonstrates that it's Philoponus, not Cosmos, who presents a better model for the Christian endeavoring to interact with science. And here's the important thing to remember about Philoponus. His insights lead to a genuine advance in the field of science. What makes Philoponus scientifically significant is that in the realm of physics, he moves the ball forward. So, I think the flat versus round debate seems to indicate that we should follow Philoponus while keeping some of the concerns of Cosmos in mind. Thank you.